thank you so much for coming out tonight. I am deeply grateful for the invitation to return to FIU. This is my first kind of official visit since graduating 20 years ago, and yes, I am dating myself, and that is okay, because aging is a good thing, especially as a Black woman in the United States. I'm not going to go there. So I am grateful for the invitation. Thank you, Luna, Sasha, and John. And I really had a wonderful lunch today on campus. Again, it was my first time back in a long time. And the campus, the South Campus, is very different. What was really interesting about our conversation was that most of the folks in the room didn't even know that FIU had a humanities program because it's no longer in existence. And that is what I got my bachelor's in. And so the humanities program was actually at the Biscayne Bay campus. There you go, yes, yes. And so that is where I spent my time while here. And so, just talking also about the impact of the program and my time here. And as I've been preparing to come and for these conversations, I always look for the through lines in terms of who I am today, particularly when it comes to scholarship. And my time at FIU was actually pretty formative. It was, as I shared earlier with the group, I learned about community in a very different way, particularly on the North Campus with a group of folks that I had not really engaged growing up. I'm a military kid, so I understand a little bit about community from moving and being part of a military family and community, but there was something very different when I came to FIU and the Biscayne Bay campus specifically, was connecting with a very large Caribbean community that I had not experienced outside of my family, and really having an understanding of what it means to show up for each other. And that has actually carried through with my work. And I'm happy to answer questions about Three Walls later, but it is part of the foundation for not just my work at Three Walls, but my larger cultural practice. So wanted to give props actually to FIU and the humanities program, particularly in terms of also the way that I think about art and culture. And I was very, very sad and disappointed when they got rid of the program because it was very life-changing for me. So just wanted to put that out there. All right, so today I'm gonna talk a little bit about Black women in the Harlem Renaissance. It's gonna be a little bit different. This is not gonna be a traditional art history lecture or talk. I have really moved away from that because I don't find them to be that engaging. And I also think to privilege the person is deeply important, particularly when it comes to racialized and gendered bodies. And so with that, I hope that y'all will just kind of go on the journey with me. And then after I speak, we'll take like a 5-minute break, and then we'll screen the Searching for Augusta Savage doc. What follows is a stream of consciousness, or what I like to call #curatorial musings. What I am sharing with you all are notes, thoughts, musings as I return to art historical and curatorial scholarship about Black women artists. In this, I also include writers, theorists, philosophers, who often, like visual artists, work across disciplines and are influenced by what shapes our culture, and perhaps most importantly, our humanity. Join me on this meandering journey about Black girls and women and their contributions from the shadows, from the margins, from the in-between space. The current exhibition highlighting the significance of the Harlem Renaissance on view here aligns with some of my thoughts and work on and about Black women artists and creatives, their lives and their works of art. Specifically, I was really kind of meditating on part of the exhibition's title, Silhouettes, which has inspired these musings, particularly when I think about 18th and 19th century silhouettes, which were popular and inexpensive and quickly made graphic portraits of individuals, animals, and nature. Presumably named after the 18th century French finance minister, Etienne de Silhouette, whose tenure as the finance minister included extreme cost-cutting at the expense of the livelihood of French citizens, which made him not well-liked. Silhouettes or shades, shadow pictures, or profiles, as they were called, were an affordable and democratic way for individuals to engage in documenting their presence, their being. It was a more accessible form than traditional portrait painting, which helped to expand the ways in which individuals could document their being in visual form. Without getting into the history of portraiture, because that's a whole nother talk that could go on, and specifically portrait painting of the period and before, portraiture was largely reserved during this time for the affluent political and religious leaders and others deemed worthy of having their likeness immortalized in the medium. In reflecting on the name shadow portrait, I thought about the Black figure and silhouettes and the connection to the Harlem Renaissance visual culture and the exhibition on view. Aaron Douglas comes to mind, particularly his mural series that feature silhouettes that not only recall 18th century silhouette scenes, but also Greek pottery that had human forms depicted in silhouette form. When looking at the images of Douglas's silhouette murals, I became curious about silhouettes or shadow portraits of Black women, being curious about the visual representation of Black women during the 18th century as the Harlem Renaissance expanded Black figurative and visual representations during a time of continued violent attacks on the Black body, physically, visually, and in literature. This is the Black girl's silhouette, circa 1770s. It's a portrait in the Victoria Gallery and Museum at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom. It's one example that I came across in my quest for silhouette images of Black women. According to the museum, the unidentified girl is a Black girl or young woman because along with the portrait, there are a couple of notes about her. The first note, which you see at the top, says, Black girl lived at Mr. Coupland's or Ormskirk, time of slave trade in Liverpool. In the second note, it states that she was, quote, good without pretense and a safe companion, end quote. We only know that she is a Black girl because of the note that accompanies the portrait. And while we do not know her name, we do have a sense of her life. She was most likely enslaved and not just lived at Mr. Copeland's, but also was considered his property. There is a possibility, as the Victoria Museum and Gallery states, that, quote, she may have traveled from the Caribbean through a connection to a plantation owner, or she may have been born in Britain to one or more Black parents settled here, end quote. We also learned from the description that she was perceived to be good, which means from the lens of whiteness that she was no trouble or she was passive. Her character is described and offered to a public that it would encounter the silhouette in the Gregson Memorial Institute, which housed the collection of Matthew Gregson Sr. It is also believed that Gregson was the person who cut the portrait of the Black girl. The Black girl's story is not unlike many of African descent during slavery. We know very little about her lived experience from her. While this is the case, her image in the form of the silhouette as part of a visual culture, intentionally or unintentionally, offers a shaping of my thoughts for this evening and for Black women and girls throughout and across time and history. Living in the shadows, dreaming in the shadows, creating in the shadows. What is dreamt and created in the shadows of white supremacy, whiteness, the patriarchy, and misogynoir contribute to our culture and society, which often go overlooked because of the systems of oppression. Systems that oppress all of us, even the ones who created, uphold, and benefit from the systems. The shadows. I imagine this Black girl who was unidentified by name, sitting by candlelight with her profile shadow projected and dreaming that someone in the future would discover her, consider her life, and appreciate that she was here, even in the conditions of possible servitude in which she may have lived out the rest of her days. Evidence of being. Though there may not be much research about the sitter, she deserves acknowledgement. Without her, we would not be thinking about or talking about this Black girl. Of course, the creator deserves acknowledgement as well. The creator and sitter needed each other to create this portrait, a portrait that is part of the 18th century art history and visual culture. If as an art historian or curator or an intellectually curious person, if we are not asking questions about the sitter or the subject, or not asking who else is part of this period, then we're doing the period, the artists, the creatives, and the subjects a disservice. We are doing humanity a disservice. The shadows hold evidence of what is not seen, not felt, the very things that usher in the possibilities. The Harlem Renaissance. This period is definitive evidence of Black being through music, dance, literature, and visual arts. Black creativity that carried forward generations of Black folks' contributions to a culture and society that worked to keep them, us, in the shadows, in the margins, in the in-between space. Carried forward the poets, the artisans, the orators, and the storytellers. Very often, though, the discussion of the Harlem Renaissance centers Black men, while Black women fall into the margins or the shadows. This defining period of political, cultural, and artistic legacy making simply would not have come to be what it is and has without the invisible physical, intellectual, emotional, and creative labor of Black women. As is the case with many political, cultural, and social movements throughout history, women are often in the background, not to mention women are often in the background, as well as not to mention gay, lesbian, trans, and queer folks. And when we do acknowledge the labor of women, it's usually one or two women who are martyred. As a people, we forget or ignore the collectivity and the community that define these moments and movements. And truth be told, the folks doing the heavy lifting of strategizing, advocating, building, loving, and caring are the most marginalized. From this perspective, in an effort to shine a light on Black women of the Harlem Renaissance, I am thinking about Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, Augusta Christine Savage, and Selma Burke. And for tonight, I am actually not going to talk about Zora Neale Hurston, primarily because as I am working on kind of new research, I wasn't ready to share that. But she's definitely top of mind. My thoughts and musings do not privilege the artistic output of these artists. It privileges their buttressing of the Harlem Renaissance with expansiveness. An expansiveness that offers a way to reconsider the Renaissance and the role of artists in community and creating community legacy. Not privileging the art is a political choice, one rooted in honoring the fullness of Blackness, Black bodies, and Black humanity. Black people are more than what we produce. We are more than our struggles. And I'm gonna pause there just to say, as an art historian and curator, introduced to art through the object. And I do believe the object is deeply important. I also believe that given where we are today, particularly in the contemporary art world where the art market drives a lot of value in many ways for artists and their objects, and particularly the increase of visibility of Black artists and institutions and collectors moving to buy the work because it's more affordable, primarily because it's always been undervalued, there's a disembodiment that tends to happen. We only focus on what is going to increase in value and completely forget about the person who actually made it. So that is why I have shifted kind of my practice to center the humanity of artists. And I have begun to do that more and more with some of my artistic projects or curatorial projects, beginning with Augusta Savage. But I wanted to state that because I do think it's deeply important to remember the person connected to the making. Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins exemplifies the breadth of Blackness and the role of the artist in our society. Born in Portland, Maine in 1859, Hopkins is best known as a novelist, a playwright, and an editor. From 1900 to 1904, she served in editorial roles at the Colored American magazine. Oops. And this is an example of one of the magazine's issues. So the Colored American magazine was a publication that promoted African American literature, held space for more accurate representations of African American culture and history, and took aim at the injustices Black folks faced. Hopkins was the editor of the Women's Department, literary editor, and eventually editor-in-chief, the latter in 1904. The Colored American magazine was the foremost and most widely circulated magazine where the national Black politic was shaped, creating a pathway for W.E.B. Du Bois's Crisis magazine. So this is before Crisis. And actually Du Bois wrote for Colored American magazine. The Colored American magazine offered Hopkins a platform to advocate for justice, present the humanity of Black folks, and contribute to the activist environment she was part of. This space, in addition to her novels, Hagar's Daughter, A Story of Southern Prejudice, Winona, A Tale of Negro Life in the South and Southwest, and Of One Blood, or, which she serialized in the magazine, are examples of spaces where race women were developed. Race women, an important descriptor, an active value of Black women during this period of the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance. It is this framework that I'm reflecting on as Hopkins's contribution to the Harlem Renaissance. In the essay titled Some Literary Workers, published in March 1902's issue of the Colored American magazine, Hopkins documents some Black women writers and poets, and those that she documented were Phyllis Wheatley, Ida B. Wells, and Gertrude L. Fortune. However, before getting to the work of these women in this essay, Hopkins frames her essay through the lens of race relations and womanhood, specifically Black womanhood. What stands out in this essay for me is what I'm gonna quote here. "We know that it is not popular for a woman to speak or write in plain terms against political brutalities, that a woman should confine her efforts to women's work in the home and church. The colored woman holds a unique position in the economy of the world's advancement in 1902. Beyond the common duties peculiar to women's sphere, the colored woman must have an intimate knowledge of every question that agitates the councils of the world. She must understand the solution of problems that involve the alteration of the boundaries of countries and what makes and unmake governments," end quote. She continues, "Upon the Negro woman lies a great responsibility, the broadening and deepening of her race, the teaching of youth to grasp present opportunities, and greater than all, to help clear the moral atmosphere by inculcating a clear appreciation of the holy words. The Negro woman will learn, is learning many things she has not been fully aware of concerning human nature," end quote. She sets up her articulation of race woman with the aforementioned statements, which are loaded and too much to unpack here with you all. But hold on to these turn of the century words as they are ever present and relevant today in the 21st century. To close with Hopkins' definition of a race woman, I share her words. Oops. "From the time that the first importation of Africans began to add comfort and wealth to the existence of the New World community, the Negro woman has been constantly proving the intellectual character of her race in unexpected directions. Indeed, her success has been significant. From the foregoing, we conclude that it is the duty of the true race woman to study and discuss all phases of the race question." These words from Hopkins are the first printed articulation of a race woman and are the container for how I positioned Augusta Savage in my essay, Labor, Love, Legacy, Augusta Savage's Art. What makes Hopkins' statement, in addition to her work Essential Learning, is that what she did provide, what she did was provide a way for Black women coming into their own, not only at the turn of the century, but also in the Harlem Renaissance, as exemplified in Savage's art, community building, advocacy, and institution building. Hopkins gave language that Savage and many Black women working in service and in love to Black community embodied. And I will share that as I was researching for Augusta Savage, Renaissance Woman, the exhibition that I curated in 2018, as I was researching and really trying to think about how to present Augusta in a way that just wasn't a straight biography. There's very little available about Augusta's life. And I didn't want to necessarily repeat what has already been shared. And so it was an opportunity to really present Augusta in a much more robust and thoughtful way in terms of her contribution as an artist and as a Black woman during the Harlem Renaissance. And in my research, and not wanting to write a traditional, like I said, biography, came across Gwendolyn Knight calling Augusta a race woman. And so that took me down the rabbit hole of trying to learn and figure out, well, what does this actually really mean? So that is how I kind of framed the exhibition and my essay. And it's also how I think about, it gave me language for thinking about how to consider Black women cultural workers. So with regard to Augusta Savage, my thoughts are broad, yet granular. And because we're going to be viewing Searching for Augusta Savage, the documentary, I'm going to reserve sharing details about her life, art, and leadership practice because you will hear my voice again. And I don't want to be repetitive in that way. But instead, I'm gonna pose some open-ended questions about the person I call the blueprint for how many of us are able to exist as artists, creatives, and leaders in an art world that continues to be beholden to systems of oppression, marginalization, and silencing. The questions are representative of holistically attending to Savage's humanity that I continue in my work with and about Savage. And before I get to those questions, just wanna explain a little bit about this photo. So this is a photo, as the description says, Augusta Savage with guests at the opening of the first annual exhibition of the Salon of Contemporary Negro Art in Harlem. And this is actually one of two photographs from that night. The second one, which I did not include in here, shows two different things that are happening that evening. So this one is where she's somewhat celebratory. You see in the background the first exhibition. Behind her, I don't have a pointer, but there's a sculpture behind her. That is Diving Boy. And so that's one of her early sculptures. And I selected this rather than a portrait because I do think it gives a sense of who she was and the work. And it's also just nice to see the opening night of the first Black Art Gallery. So to the questions. So these are questions that are shaping my thoughts on further research about her. And they are, what was her relationship with emerging philanthropic entities? What else did she act in service to Black folks across the United States? Because we know her in Harlem. But she certainly had an impact nationally. Why was it important for her to move towards institution building? And institution building meaning not just the art schools, but even having the foresight to open up the first contemporary art gallery dedicated to Black artists. Where did her generosity stem from, particularly towards individuals assisting her on her journey? And that's a question because, again, we're in a moment right now where artists, we're in a very individualistic moment. And folks are not as generous today. And so also thinking about her life, where did the generosity come from? Particularly for someone who gave so much, but also received very little in return. What additional discourse did she add to the conversation about Black art and artists of the day? Now, she was someone who did write and speak about the arts and being a Black artist. So really interested in what is already documented that we don't know. With her role as a mentor, what gems did she impart on artists that are evidenced in their work and being? The last question is one I think about particularly to get us closer to understanding what mentorship means and what it meant to the artists she mentored. We understand that passing down knowledge through a number of ways is important, especially in Black communities where inequities impact access to education, employment, and resources. Savage had wide-reaching impact on the arts and the Black community, and it cannot be overstated the significance of the Harlem Community Arts Center. It offered different opportunities that influenced those of whom she hired or taught. And while I was preparing for this and doing some research about Selma Burke, I came across an essay. And Selma Burke, who I will be talking about next, it was an essay about Selma Burke and her institution building. And it was there was an interesting sentence in that essay saying that in terms of the Harlem Community Arts Center, it didn't have the impact that we might place on it. And I thought that was really interesting, given that the Harlem Community Arts Center was the model for WPA art centers. And so many artists went through the center, whether they taught or took classes. And so it felt like a dismissal of such a cultural beacon because of maybe how it was administered or what have you. So I do think it's important to talk about Black institutions because they exist with a lot against them in terms of sustainability. So one artist that was mentored by Augusta Savage and taught at Harlem Community Arts Center is Selma Burke. Selma Burke was born in December 1900. She was a sculptor, educator, and institution builder. And some of you may already know this, but if you have a dime in your pocket, she did the portrait. So you're carrying around Selma Burke. If you have cash. Burke, similar to Savage, took to sculpting from an early age using the white clay in North Carolina to make small objects and animals. According to the New York Post in 1945, Burke shared that, quote, "One day I was mixing the clay and I saw the imprint of my hands. I found that I could make something that I alone had created," end quote. I think about the excitement and awe of taking a raw natural material and creating something that felt so natural to do. When I think about Burke, and I am at the beginning stages of digging deeper into who she was, I cannot help but think about how sculpting, building from nothing, led her to founding her own art schools and community spaces. To be sure, she had a model in Savage, as Burke taught at the Harlem Community Arts Center, and she was also part of the social and cultural scene in Harlem. An interesting connection when we think about also community and relationship building, Burke was romantically involved with Claude McKay, and Claude McKay and Augusta were best friends. Though her sculptures followed in the stead of Savage portraiture, as we see here, it is the art schools she created that carry forward the legacy of the Renaissance that I'm most interested in, the Selma Burke School of Sculpture, which she opened in 1946. The school was not located in Harlem, but in Greenwich Village in New York. Burke's school was integrated, meaning that it was open to anyone of racial background. Burke's belief in and practice of an integrated art educational environment during the 1940s is in sharp contrast to Savage's art school, Harlem Community Arts Center. However, it was in relationship to the ongoing discourse about integration in society at large and specifically in the arts. What I find interesting about Burke's approach that is not so much different from Savage is the notion of, quote, bringing art to Negro boys and girls so there can be more appreciation for living, end quote. Yet, she believed that Black youth would be more successful in an integrated environment. And I read this as a white space, even if created as a Black person or by a Black person. Perhaps, and this has been argued by others, Burke was being more strategic during this period by having an integrated school. She bore witness to the closure of the Harlem Community Arts Center, though funded through the WPA and philanthropic entities like Carnegie. The WPA was not an exercise in equality or equity in terms of the amount of funding dispersed. It documented It is documented that Black artists were not paid equally, meaning white artists received more money and more job opportunities than Black artists. While it was a lifeline during the Depression era, it was still rooted in racist practices. So if Burke witnessed the inequality and inequity in funding, it would stand to reason that having an art school in Greenwich Village and not Harlem, and with 2/3 white students, stood more of a financial chance than a Black school, particularly because of how money tends to flow for causes that benefit the prosperity of whiteness. My thoughts may sound pessimistic, especially around the areas that are meant to be democratic and level the playing field, meaning the arts and education. And they may be, but when we look at history and history in the United States and the time period, maybe it's not so much pessimism as much as it's realism. The three women highlighted in my musing are integral to a fuller examination of the Harlem Renaissance and its outgrowth. There are varying thoughts and approaches to ways of uplifting Black folks. This period in time, a time when Black folks were more widely creating a cachet of intellectual and artistic creative works, was a testament of we are here and going to continue to be here. While much of the work these folks did countered the popular public perception of Black people as ignorant, without culture, not worthy, and so on, perhaps the most important work was about Black being, past, present, and future. Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, Augusta Savage, and Selma Burke offered this very thing in their labors of love, Black being. Thank you.